In court, my husband scoffed, "She's just a useless housewife." The words echoed through the quiet courtroom like a glass breaking. I didn't react, I didn't move. I simply stood there. The judge slowly turned toward Daniel's lawyer, his brow tightening as if something didn't add up. "You don't know who she really is, do you?" the judge asked. Daniel's lawyer went pale. His hands trembled as he flipped through the papers on his desk. My husband's face turned red as he shouted, "No, what?" And that was the moment I realized something strange. Daniel had spent 12 years living beside me, but he had never once bothered to learn who I really was. The Fairfax County Courthouse always smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. I remember noticing that as I stood beside my attorney that morning, staring at the polished wooden benches and the soft light spilling through tall windows. It was a quiet Tuesday. Outside, the early autumn air in Virginia had that crisp feeling that reminds you summer is truly over. Inside courtroom 3B, my marriage was ending. Daniel looked confident. He always did when he believed he had the upper hand. His suit was charcoal gray, the same one he wore to business conferences. His hair was combed perfectly, and his posture had that familiar arrogance I had come to know over the years. The arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His lawyer stood beside him, a younger man named Bradley Simmons, who had probably built half his career representing men like Daniel. Successful, confident, and convinced their wives were financially helpless. The judge called the room to order. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, and then Daniel spoke. "She's just a useless housewife." The sentence landed in the room like a dropped plate. I didn't respond. Not because the words didn't hurt, but because I had heard them before, more times than I could count. Daniel and I had been married for 12 years. When we first met, he had been charming. That kind of charming that older people sometimes describe as a good provider. He worked in commercial real estate in Washington, D.C., and he spoke about business with confidence and ambition. At the time, I admired that. Back then, we lived in a modest townhouse in Alexandria. We spent weekends exploring farmers markets and antique shops, talking about the kind of life we hoped to build together. I believed we were partners. And for a while, maybe we were. But something changed after Daniel's first major promotion. Success has a strange way of revealing a person's true character. Daniel began to talk differently. About money. About status. About the importance of who contributes what in a marriage. At first it was subtle. Little jokes in front of friends. "Emily doesn't have to worry about work. She's got the easy job." People laughed. I laughed too. That's what wives often do. The truth was, I had once had a career of my own. Before we married, I worked as a financial analyst for a government contractor outside Arlington. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful work. I specialized in risk analysis and federal budgeting, boring topics to most people, but the kind of work that required precision and discipline. When Daniel and I had our first serious conversation about starting a family, he suggested something that seemed reasonable at the time. "You don't have to keep working," he said. "I can provide for us." It sounded romantic then. Traditional. The kind of arrangement many couples from our parents' generation would recognize. So I stepped away from my career. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed marriage meant building something together. Over the years, Daniel's version of that arrangement slowly changed. Providing became controlling. Financial decisions were his domain. At least that's what he told people. In reality, the numbers told a very different story. But I didn't correct him. Not once. When his friends joked about me living off his paycheck. When his mother asked if I ever planned to do something productive again. When Daniel told people I had never really understood finances, I smiled. And stayed quiet. People often misunderstand silence. They think it means weakness. Sometimes it simply means patience. The real shift in our marriage happened 2 years ago. Daniel started coming home later. His phone was always face down on the kitchen counter. His conversations became shorter, more distracted. After 12 years of marriage, you learn how to read the quiet signals. One evening, he forgot his phone on the dining table. A message appeared on the screen. A name I didn't recognize. And a sentence that changed everything. "I miss you already." That was the moment the illusion ended. Many people expect anger in moments like that. Or shouting. or confrontation. But what I felt was something else entirely. Clarity. The kind that arrives quietly, like a door closing. I didn't confront him that night, or the next day. Instead, I began paying attention. Carefully. Patiently. The same way I had once studied federal budgets and risk reports. Patterns began to emerge. Unusual withdrawals. Transfers between accounts. Expenses that had nothing to do with our household. The numbers told a story Daniel never expected me to read. And once I started reading it, I realized something important. My husband thought I was invisible. A housewife. Financially dependent. Uninformed. He believed the life we had built belonged to him. Back in the courtroom, Daniel's lawyer began outlining his argument. My husband had been the primary earner. My husband had paid for the house. My husband had supported the household. And therefore, according to their narrative, Daniel deserved the majority of our shared assets. I listened quietly. My attorney didn't interrupt. Neither did I. Because the truth doesn't always need to arrive immediately. Sometimes it waits for the right moment. The judge finally leaned forward. He glanced at the documents in front of him. Then he looked directly at Daniel's lawyer. You didn't review the financial history carefully, did you? The room went silent. Daniel frowned. Confused. And suddenly, for the first time in 12 years, my husband looked uncertain. The judge tapped a page on the bench. You might want to take another look at who actually built this financial portfolio. Daniel turned toward his attorney. Wait, he said. What does that mean? And I realized something as I watched his confusion unfold. The man who had shared my home for more than a decade had absolutely no idea who I really was. If you had asked anyone in our neighborhood what kind of couple Daniel and I were, they would have described something perfectly ordinary. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Washington, D.C., the kind of place where retirees walk their dogs at sunrise and neighbors still wave from their driveways. Our house sat at the end of a tree-lined street in Fairfax County. It wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable: 2 stories, a small garden in the back, and a porch where I often drank my coffee in the mornings. From the outside, our life looked stable. Daniel had a successful career in commercial real estate. He traveled frequently between Washington and Northern Virginia, negotiating office leases and development deals. He liked to describe himself as a man who built things. I let him tell that story. But the truth was a little more complicated. The money that paid our mortgage, the retirement accounts, the investments, none of it happened by accident. And none of it happened without me. Before I left my job years earlier, I had spent nearly a decade working in financial analysis. Numbers were never just numbers to me. They were patterns, warnings, possibilities. When I stepped away from my career after marrying Daniel, I didn't stop understanding money. I simply shifted where that knowledge was used. Our finances became my quiet responsibility. Daniel believed he managed everything because his name appeared on the paychecks. But every evening after dinner, while he watched television or answered work emails, I sat at the small desk in our study reviewing spreadsheets, savings, investment accounts, retirement funds, tax planning. I didn't announce what I was doing, I simply did it. Over time, small adjustments became large outcomes. When Daniel wanted to invest heavily in a risky commercial project in 2014, I suggested a more balanced approach. He didn't realize that the diversified option he casually approved was a portfolio I had spent weeks researching. When the stock market dipped during the pandemic, Daniel panicked. We should pull out before we lose everything, he said. I gently suggested patience. Markets recover. They almost always do. 2 years later, the same investments had doubled. Daniel bragged to his friends about his good instincts. I poured another cup of coffee and stayed quiet. Silence became a habit in our marriage. Not a painful silence. Just practical. Daniel liked the image of himself as the provider. It made him feel strong, important. Correcting him would only have embarrassed him. So I allowed the illusion to continue. Sometimes people assume power always belongs to the loudest person in the room. But that isn't always true. Often real power sits quietly in the corner watching everything. Daniel's personality changed gradually over the years. Success amplified traits that had always been there beneath the surface. Confidence slowly became arrogance. Pride slowly became entitlement. By the time our 10th anniversary arrived, Daniel spoke about our life as though it were something he had built alone. My house, my investments, my retirement. Even when speaking to mutual friends, at first it bothered me. Then eventually it didn't. Because the numbers in our accounts told a different story. And numbers don't care about ego. The first time Daniel openly referred to me as a housewife was during a dinner party. It was a small gathering with neighbors, most of them couples around our age or older. Someone asked what I had done before getting married. Daniel laughed. "Oh, Emily escaped the workforce," he joked. "She retired early." Everyone chuckled politely. And now the neighbor asked. Daniel lifted his wine glass. "She runs the house, best housewife in Fairfax County." More laughter. I smiled. But later that night after the guests left, I asked him something quietly. "Do you really think that's all I do?" Daniel looked surprised. "Well, isn't it?" He didn't mean it cruelly. At least I don't think he did. But that was the moment I realized something important. My husband genuinely believed the story he told others. He believed it because I had never corrected him. Life settled into a predictable rhythm. Daniel worked long hours. I managed the home. We attended neighborhood gatherings, holiday dinners, and the occasional charity event tied to Daniel's work. If someone had asked me then whether I was happy, I probably would have said yes. Not passionately, not enthusiastically, but honestly enough, we were stable, comfortable, predictable. For many couples, especially as they grow older, that kind of life is enough. But stability can hide cracks for a long time before anyone notices. Looking back now, the signs were there long before the message on Daniel's phone. The late meetings. The sudden interest in staying overnight near his office downtown. The way he guarded his phone like it contained state secrets. At first I ignored it. After 12 years of marriage, suspicion feels exhausting. But once you notice the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. And patterns were something I had always been good at recognizing. The message appeared on a quiet Thursday evening. Daniel had come home late, dropped his phone on the dining table, and gone upstairs to shower. I wasn't snooping. At least not intentionally. The phone simply lit up. A notification. A name I didn't recognize. Rachel. And beneath it one short sentence. "I miss you already." That was all it took. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting. Just a moment of silent understanding. Something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Just clarity. That night, I sat alone in the living room after Daniel went to bed. I thought about the 12 years we had spent building a life together. The house. The accounts. The plans we had once made for retirement. Then I opened my laptop. Old habits return quickly when you need them. Within an hour, I was reviewing our financial records. Transaction histories. Bank transfers. Credit card statements. The numbers began forming a familiar pattern. Hotel charges. Restaurant bills. Small transfers between accounts. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to tell a story. The kind of story Daniel believed I couldn't read. For the next several months, I didn't say anything. I continued cooking dinner. Watering the garden. Smiling politely at neighbors. But behind the quiet routines, I began preparing. Carefully. Methodically. Just like I used to prepare financial risk reports years ago. Except this time the risk wasn't a budget forecast. It was my marriage. Daniel thought I was invisible. He thought the life we built belonged entirely to him. And the strange thing was, that belief was exactly what would eventually undo him. Back in the courtroom, Daniel still hadn't realized any of this. He sat confidently beside his attorney, waiting for the judge to accept the narrative they had prepared. A successful man. A dependent wife. A simple divorce. But as the judge flipped through the financial documents in front of him, his expression slowly changed. And for the first time since the hearing began, I saw something Daniel hadn't expected. Doubt. Doubt. It appeared on Daniel's face for only a second in the courtroom, but I noticed it. After 12 years of marriage, I knew every version of his expressions. His confident smile, his irritated frown, the tight jaw he got when someone challenged him. But doubt was rare. Daniel was not a man who liked uncertainty. He preferred simple stories. Stories where he was right. Stories where he was in control. And the story he had been telling for years was simple. He was the provider, and I was the dependent wife. The problem with simple stories is that reality tends to be much more complicated. 2 years before that courtroom morning, the reality of my marriage had quietly changed. It started the night I saw the message on Daniel's phone. "Rachel, I miss you already." The words themselves were not dramatic. But sometimes a single sentence is enough to confirm something you've already begun to suspect. When Daniel came downstairs later that evening, his hair still damp from the shower, he kissed my cheek and asked what I wanted to watch on television. His voice sounded normal, comfortable, as if nothing had changed. I studied his face for a moment. The same man I had shared 12 years of dinners with. The same man who had once helped me assemble a bookshelf in our first apartment. The same man who had promised we would grow old together. For a moment I considered confronting him, asking who Rachel was, demanding an explanation. But then something else crossed my mind. A question I hadn't asked myself before. What else don't I know? So instead of speaking, I simply smiled and said I wasn't in the mood for television. "I think I'll go to bed early," I told him. Daniel shrugged and turned on the news. And that was the moment my silence began. People often imagine betrayal as something explosive. Shouting. Accusations. Doors slamming. But in reality, betrayal is usually much quieter. It unfolds in small discoveries. Small confirmations. Tiny details that slowly form a picture. Over the next few weeks, I began paying closer attention to Daniel's routines. Not obsessively. Just carefully. His work trips increased. He started spending more nights downtown near his office. He bought new shirts. More expensive ones. And he became protective of his phone in a way he never had before. Patterns. That was the word my old job used constantly. Patterns reveal risk. Patterns reveal truth. And Daniel's patterns were becoming clearer every day. One evening while Daniel was in the shower again, I opened the laptop we shared in the study. Most couples have some level of financial transparency. At least that had always been the case for us. Daniel never imagined I would be interested in reviewing bank statements. That had always been his territory. But as I logged into our accounts, I quickly realized something. Daniel hadn't hidden anything particularly well. Because he didn't believe he needed to. That was his biggest mistake. The credit card statements told the first part of the story. Restaurants I had never visited. Upscale wine bars in Arlington. Hotel charges near the Georgetown waterfront. And then the smaller details. 2 dinners. 2 cocktails. Valet parking for 2. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. But the financial records showed something else too. Something Daniel probably believed was too complicated for me to notice. Money transfers. Small ones at first. Then larger ones. Funds moving from our joint accounts into a separate account under Daniel's name. It was subtle. Spread across months. But the pattern was unmistakable. Daniel wasn't just having an affair. He was quietly preparing for something else. A future where I wasn't included. I remember sitting at my desk that night staring at the numbers on the screen. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Most people might have cried. Or felt angry. But what I felt was something colder. Focus. The same focus I used to feel when analyzing complicated financial reports. When a system begins behaving unpredictably, the worst thing you can do is panic. You study it. You document it. You prepare. So that's exactly what I did. Over the next year, I began quietly collecting information. Bank statements. Transaction histories. Email confirmations. Nothing illegal. Nothing sneaky. Just records. Daniel continued living his life as if nothing had changed. He traveled. He attended business dinners. He occasionally stayed overnight for meetings. And when he came home, he behaved like the same confident man who believed he controlled everything. Sometimes he even complained about money. "Taxes are getting ridiculous," he said one evening over dinner. "We should think about protecting our assets." I nodded politely. The irony was almost impressive. Because the person who had actually been protecting our assets for 12 years was sitting across from him at the table. Rachel eventually appeared more clearly in the financial records. A few payments. Gifts. Transfers labeled as consulting help. Daniel wasn't particularly creative with explanations. But by then I wasn't interested in confronting him. Confrontation would have changed the situation too early. And timing in situations like this matters more than emotion. I wasn't preparing revenge. At least not the dramatic kind people imagine. I was preparing clarity. Because sooner or later Daniel was going to make a move. And when he did, I intended to be ready. That moment arrived one quiet Saturday morning. Daniel placed a manila envelope on the kitchen counter while I was pouring coffee. His expression was calm. Almost rehearsed. "I think we need to talk," he said. Inside the envelope were divorce papers. He explained it as politely as possible. Things had changed. We had grown apart. It would be better for both of us. He had already spoken to a lawyer. Everything would be fair. Simple. Straightforward. And then he said something that revealed exactly what he believed about me. "Don't worry," Daniel added. "My attorney says these cases are usually pretty quick when one spouse doesn't really have financial involvement." I remember looking at him for a long moment. Not angry. Just thoughtful. Because Daniel genuinely believed that sentence. He believed I had never been involved. Never understood. Never contributed. And suddenly I realized something strange. The man who thought he was ending our marriage had absolutely no idea what he had just started. Back in the courtroom 2 years later, Daniel still didn't understand. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgently. The attorney flipped through the financial documents again. His face grew paler with each page. The judge watched them quietly. Then he turned toward my attorney. "Counsel," the judge said calmly. "Would you like to explain these investment records?" My attorney stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "I believe the court should understand exactly who has been managing the Carter household finances for the last 12 years. Daniel frowned. Confused. And in that moment I realized the story he had been telling everyone was about to collapse. When Daniel placed the divorce papers on the kitchen counter that morning, he spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed everything was already settled. "I don't want this to get ugly," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "We can handle it like adults." The sunlight coming through the kitchen window landed directly on the envelope between us. Fairfax County Circuit Court. I remember reading the words without really reacting. Daniel mistook that for weakness. Or maybe indifference. In reality, it was something else entirely. Preparation. Because by the time Daniel handed me those papers, I had already spent nearly a year quietly studying every financial move he had made. He just didn't know it yet. Daniel explained the situation the way people often explain uncomfortable truths, carefully, but with a certain impatience. "We've grown apart," he said. "I think we both know that." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because there was no point interrupting him. He had rehearsed this speech. I could tell. He spoke about practicality. About moving on. About avoiding unnecessary conflict. Then he mentioned something that almost made me smile. "My attorney says this should be straightforward," he continued. "You didn't really handle the finances, so the court usually keeps things simple." I took a sip of coffee before answering. "I see." Daniel interpreted that as surrender. He always had a talent for misunderstanding silence. Later that afternoon, after Daniel left for work, I sat down at the same desk where I had spent years quietly managing our household finances. The divorce papers were neatly arranged in front of me. I read them slowly. Daniel was requesting the house, most of our investment accounts, the majority of our savings. He had even listed several accounts as personal financial management assets, implying they were his professional decisions. I couldn't help noticing something. The documents didn't mention the detailed financial records I had been keeping for years. Which meant one thing. Daniel's lawyer hadn't looked closely enough. That evening I made a phone call. The attorney I contacted was someone a neighbor had recommended years earlier. His name was Richard Alden, a man in his early 60s who had spent decades practicing family law in Northern Virginia. When he answered the phone, his voice carried the calm patience of someone who had heard every possible version of a divorce story. "Mr. Alden speaking. My name is Emily Carter," I said. "I think I may need some advice." We met 2 days later in his office in Alexandria. The building was older, with wooden floors that creaked slightly when you walked down the hallway. His office smelled faintly of books and strong coffee. Richard Alden looked exactly like you might expect an experienced attorney to look. Gray hair, kind eyes, A quiet, observant expression. He didn't interrupt much while I explained the situation. I told him about Daniel, about the divorce filing, about the financial records, and finally about the documents I had quietly collected over the past year. When I finished speaking, Richard leaned back in his chair. Then he said something that surprised me. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "your husband appears to have made a very serious mistake. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed everything. The investment accounts, the retirement portfolios, the property records, the transaction histories. Every piece of financial information Daniel believed belonged exclusively to him." Richard studied the spreadsheets carefully. Then he looked up at me with a small smile. "Did you manage all of this?" he asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "About 12 years. He leaned back again. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains a lot." Richard explained something important about divorce cases. Courts don't just look at who earns money. They look at contributions, financial management, asset growth, long-term planning. In many marriages, especially traditional ones, one spouse may earn income while the other manages the financial stability behind the scenes. And courts recognize that. Daniel's mistake was assuming they wouldn't. Over the next several weeks, Richard began preparing our response to Daniel's filing. But he suggested something unusual. "We don't need to rush," he said one afternoon while reviewing documents. "Your husband believes he understands the situation." "And he doesn't?" Richard smiled slightly. "Not even close." Daniel, meanwhile, behaved exactly the way Richard predicted. Confident, relaxed, occasionally even generous. He told mutual friends the divorce would be amicable. He assured everyone we had agreed on a fair arrangement. In public, he remained polite, almost relieved. But privately, the financial moves continued. Small transfers, quiet adjustments to accounts, the kind of behavior someone might attempt if they believed their spouse would never notice. Fortunately, numbers don't forget. And neither do records. The official court filings began a few months later. Daniel's lawyer submitted documentation describing him as the primary financial decision-maker of our marriage. They referred to me several times as a non-working spouse. One document even used the phrase financially dependent housewife. Richard handed me a copy of that filing during one of our meetings. "Do you mind that description?" he asked. I read the sentence once. Then I placed the document back on the desk. "No," I said calmly. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it means they still don't understand." Richard nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Months passed as the case moved toward a hearing. Daniel continued living as though the outcome was already decided. He took Rachel on trips. He upgraded his car. He even talked openly about moving into a new apartment once the divorce was finalized. Every action he took confirmed the same assumption: that the life we built together belonged entirely to him. Meanwhile, Richard and I prepared quietly. We organized 12 years of financial records, investment reports, transaction logs, detailed spreadsheets showing exactly how our assets had grown over time. And more importantly, who had managed them. The night before the court hearing, Richard called me. "Are you nervous?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said honestly. "Why not?" Because the truth was something I had spent years building. And truths built on careful preparation rarely collapse. Back in the courtroom the next morning, Daniel looked relaxed as the hearing began. He whispered something to his lawyer. Probably a joke. Maybe a prediction about how quickly the judge would settle the matter. But as my attorney began organizing the financial documents on the table in front of him, I noticed something. Daniel's lawyer leaned forward. He stared at the papers. Then he turned another page. And another. His expression slowly changed. Confusion. Then concern. Finally, something very close to panic. The judge tapped the bench lightly. "Mr. Simmons," he said to Daniel's attorney, "did you personally review the full investment records for this marriage?" Daniel's lawyer hesitated. And for the first time since this entire process began, I saw Daniel turn toward his attorney with a look of uncertainty. "What's going on?" he whispered. Richard Alden stood calmly beside me. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe the court may find the financial management history of this marriage enlightening. Courtrooms have a way of slowing time. Every sound feels louder. Every movement carries weight. As Richard Alden stood beside me that morning in Fairfax County Circuit Court, I noticed small things most people probably wouldn't. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above, the slow ticking of the wall clock, the soft scratching sound of a pen as the court clerk took notes. And Daniel. Daniel sat a few feet away, leaning toward his attorney with a confused expression I had never seen on his face before. For 12 years, Daniel had believed he understood our marriage perfectly. But now the narrative he had built was beginning to shift. And he could feel it. Richard didn't rush. Experienced attorneys rarely do. Instead, he calmly organized the folders on the table in front of him, each one containing years of financial records. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Your Honor, before we discuss asset division, I believe the court should understand how these assets were actually created. Daniel's lawyer shifted in his seat. I'm not sure that's necessary, he said quickly. Richard smiled politely. I believe it is. The judge nodded. Proceed. Richard opened the first folder. For the past 12 years, he began Mrs. Emily Carter has been responsible for managing the household's financial portfolio. Daniel's attorney frowned. That's incorrect, he interrupted. Mr. Carter is the primary income earner. Richard nodded. That is true, he said calmly. But income and financial management are not the same thing. He handed a document to the court clerk. Then another. And another. Investment statements. Portfolio growth charts. Detailed financial records. Richard spoke slowly, making sure every sentence was clear. When Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter married in 2011, their combined savings totaled approximately $180,000. The judge glanced down at the document. That's correct. Richard turned the page. Today, the Carter marital portfolio exceeds $2.4 million. Daniel blinked. The number clearly surprised him. But the judge simply looked up. And Richard placed a spreadsheet on the bench. The investment strategy responsible for that growth was designed, executed, and maintained entirely by Mrs. Carter. The courtroom went very quiet. Daniel leaned toward his attorney again. What is he talking about? He whispered. His lawyer didn't answer, because he was staring at the documents Richard had just presented. Richard continued. These records include 12 years of transaction histories, investment allocations, and portfolio management decisions. He paused briefly, all of which were made by Mrs. Carter. Daniel finally spoke out loud. That's ridiculous. The judge looked up sharply. Mr. Carter, you'll speak only when addressed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated, but also confused. Very confused. Richard then presented the next set of documents. These records also show several attempted asset transfers by Mr. Carter during the past 18 months. The judge's expression changed slightly. Transfers? Yes, Your Honor. Richard pointed to a series of highlighted transactions. Funds were moved from joint accounts into accounts held solely in Mr. Carter's name. Daniel shifted in his chair. His attorney finally spoke. There's nothing illegal about that. Richard nodded. That depends on whether those transfers were properly disclosed during divorce filings. The judge examined the document carefully. Then he looked up at Daniel's attorney. Were they? The lawyer hesitated. And that hesitation said everything. Daniel's confidence was beginning to crack. You said everything was handled, he whispered sharply to his attorney. The lawyer didn't respond. He was flipping through papers now, his hands moving faster than before. Richard continued his explanation with the same calm tone he had used since the beginning. Your Honor, Mrs. Carter chose not to confront her husband about these financial actions. The judge looked toward me. And why is that, Mrs. Carter? For the first time that morning I spoke. Because I believed the court would eventually need to see the full picture. My voice sounded calm. Even to me. Richard nodded slightly before continuing. In addition to managing the investment portfolio, Mrs. Carter also prevented significant financial losses during several risky business ventures initiated by Mr. Carter. Daniel's head snapped up. What? Richard handed another document to the judge. This report shows that in 2014, Mr. Carter attempted to invest a substantial portion of the family's savings into a commercial real estate project that later collapsed. The judge read the document carefully. And what prevented the loss? Richard turned slightly toward me. Mrs. Carter recommended diversifying the investment portfolio instead. Daniel looked stunned. That was my decision, he said. Richard shook his head gently. No, Mr. Carter. He pointed to the email printed in the report. This message was written by Mrs. Carter. Daniel stared at the paper. He had probably forgotten that email entirely. But I remembered writing it. I remembered calculating the risk percentages. I remembered suggesting the safer strategy. And I remembered Daniel agreeing to it without much thought. Because he trusted my instincts, even if he never acknowledged them. The judge leaned back in his chair. So if I'm understanding correctly, he said slowly, Mrs. Carter has been responsible for the financial growth of this marriage for more than a decade. Richard nodded. That is correct, Your Honor. The judge then turned to Daniel's attorney. And you were aware of this? The lawyer looked pale. No, Your Honor. Daniel looked between them in disbelief. What do you mean you didn't know, he demanded. The lawyer cleared his throat. These documents weren't included in the original disclosures. Daniel turned toward me. You never told anyone about this. He sounded almost offended. I met his gaze calmly. You never asked. For a moment the courtroom was completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of tension, but the quiet silence that happens when a story suddenly changes direction. For 12 years Daniel had believed I was simply a housewife, a quiet presence in the background of his life. But now the court was seeing something very different. A financial strategist. A planner. Someone who had quietly built the stability Daniel believed came from his paycheck alone. The judge looked down at the documents one last time. Then he turned toward Daniel's attorney. I believe we need to reconsider several aspects of this case. Daniel's face had lost its color. What does that mean, he asked. But no one answered him immediately. Because for the first time since this hearing began, the truth had finally caught up with the story he had been telling. The silence in the courtroom felt different now. Before it had been the comfortable silence of routine lawyers presenting arguments, judges reviewing documents, the slow machinery of the legal system moving along familiar tracks. Now it was something else. Heavy. Expectant. The kind of silence that appears when people realize the story they believed may not be the real one. Daniel sat rigidly in his chair, staring at the stack of documents in front of the judge. His confidence had drained away. In its place was something I hadn't seen in a long time. Uncertainty. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the financial records Richard had provided. These are extensive, he said. Richard nodded. Yes, Your Honor, Mrs. Carter maintained detailed documentation of every financial decision made within the marriage. Daniel's attorney cleared his throat. With respect, Your Honor, managing spreadsheets doesn't necessarily mean someone was responsible for the financial strategy. Richard smiled faintly. I agree, he said. Which is why we also submitted the investment directives. The judge raised an eyebrow. Investment directives. Richard handed over another folder. These include the actual investment allocations, diversification models, and long-term planning reports created by Mrs. Carter. Daniel leaned toward his attorney again. You said she didn't handle this stuff. The lawyer didn't answer. He simply stared at the documents. Richard continued speaking calmly. Your Honor, Mrs. Carter didn't simply track finances. He pointed to a series of charts on the judge's desk. She designed the portfolio strategy that grew the Carter household assets from under $200,000 to more than $2 million. The judge looked impressed. That is, substantial growth. Richard nodded. And it happened consistently over a 12-year period. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. That's impossible. The judge looked up. Mr. Carter, you'll remain quiet unless addressed. Daniel sat back again, but his face had turned the same deep red I remembered from the beginning of the hearing. The same color it had been when he shouted across the courtroom earlier. No, what? Now he was beginning to understand. Richard opened the final folder. There's one more matter the court should consider. Daniel's attorney looked alarmed. What matter? Richard slid several printed documents toward the bench. These are financial transfers Mr. Carter made during the 18 months prior to filing for divorce. The judge studied them carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. These funds were moved from joint accounts. Yes, Your Honor. And these accounts were not disclosed during the initial filing. That is correct. The judge looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Carter, can you explain that?" Daniel looked stunned. I moved some money," he said. "There's nothing illegal about that." The judge nodded slowly. "No, not necessarily." He tapped the documents with his pen. "But failing to disclose those transfers during divorce proceedings is another matter." Daniel's lawyer finally spoke again. "Your Honor, these were routine transfers." Richard shook his head gently. "With respect, they were not." He pointed to the highlighted numbers. "Nearly $200,000 was moved into a private account during the months leading up to this filing." The courtroom murmured quietly. Even the clerk looked up. Daniel turned toward me then. For the first time that morning, he looked genuinely shaken. "You were watching all of this?" His voice carried something I hadn't heard in years. Vulnerability. I answered honestly. "I was paying attention." Richard stepped forward again. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carter chose not to confront these actions directly." The judge glanced toward me. "And why not?" "Because I believe the court deserved to see the entire financial picture," I said. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "That seems reasonable." Daniel's lawyer leaned toward him and whispered something urgently. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Daniel's reaction. Shock. Then frustration. Then something close to panic. He looked back toward the judge. "Your Honor, this is being blown out of proportion." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes." The judge leaned back slightly. "Well, Mr. Carter, here is what I see." He lifted one of the financial reports. "I see a household investment portfolio that has grown significantly over more than a decade." He lifted another. "I see documentation showing that Mrs. Carter created and managed the strategy responsible for that growth." Then he tapped the transfer records. "And I see undisclosed financial movements that raise questions about transparency." Daniel's jaw tightened. The judge turned to Daniel's attorney. "Mr. Simmons, I assume you were unaware of these details when you described Mrs. Carter as financially dependent." The attorney looked exhausted. "That appears to be the case, Your Honor." The judge looked back at Daniel. Then at me. Then he said something that seemed to settle the entire room. "Mr. Carter, it appears that the financial stability you've enjoyed for the past decade may have been built by the person you just described as a useless housewife." The words hung in the air. Daniel didn't respond. Because there was nothing he could say. The judge closed the final folder. "I will take these documents under review before issuing a decision on asset division." He paused briefly. "But based on what I've seen so far, the court will be giving significant weight to Mrs. Carter's financial contributions." Daniel looked as if someone had knocked the air out of him. For years he had believed the life we built together belonged entirely to him. Now the truth had caught up. Not through anger. Not through revenge. But through the quiet weight of facts. As the hearing ended and people began gathering their papers, Daniel remained seated. He stared at the table in front of him. Finally he looked toward me. "I didn't know," he said quietly. His voice no longer carried arrogance. Only confusion. I studied his face for a moment. Then I answered the only honest way I could. "You never asked." The courthouse hallway was quiet when the hearing ended. Most people had already left. The afternoon light from the tall windows stretched across the polished floor, and the faint echo of footsteps carried down the long corridor. Richard Alden shook my hand before heading back toward the elevator. "You handled that with remarkable composure," he said. "I had good preparation," I replied. He smiled gently. "Preparation helps," he said, "but patience helped more." Then he gave a small nod and disappeared into the elevator. And just like that, I was standing alone. Or at least I thought I was. "Emily." Daniel's voice came from behind me. I turned slowly. He stood several feet away, holding his briefcase loosely in one hand. The confidence he had carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. His shoulders looked slightly hunched, as though the day had added 10 years to his posture. For a moment neither of us spoke. 12 years of marriage has a strange way of leaving silence between two people. Eventually Daniel broke it. "I didn't know any of that," he said. His voice sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. I studied him quietly. "I believe that," I said. We walked toward the exit together. Outside, the late afternoon air carried that familiar Virginia autumn chill. People moved through the courthouse steps, lawyers, families, couples with their own stories unfolding behind closed doors. Life continuing the way it always does. Daniel stopped near the parking lot. "I feel like an idiot," he said after a moment. I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was complicated. And honesty, especially after a long marriage, deserves a little care. "You weren't paying attention," I said finally. "That's different." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "I thought I understood everything about our life." That was the problem. For years, Daniel had believed the story he told everyone. The successful husband. The dependent wife. The simple arrangement. But life rarely fits neatly into the stories we tell. Marriage is not always about who earns the paycheck. Sometimes it's about who quietly holds everything together when no one is watching. The judge's final ruling came several weeks later. The decision was thorough and detailed. The court recognized my role in managing and growing our financial portfolio. Daniel's undisclosed transfers were addressed. The division of assets reflected the reality that both partners had contributed just in different ways. When the process was finally complete, Daniel kept part of the estate. But not the majority he had expected. And certainly not the narrative he had walked into that courtroom believing. A month later, I moved into a smaller home just outside Alexandria. It had a white front porch and a maple tree in the yard that turned brilliant red in the fall. The house was quieter than the one Daniel and I had shared. But the quiet felt peaceful. Not empty. Just calm. Sometimes in the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the neighbors walking their dogs down the street. Life had changed. But it hadn't ended. In many ways, it had simply begun again. Daniel and I spoke a few times after the divorce. Not often. Just occasional conversations about paperwork or shared accounts that needed to be finalized. But one conversation stayed with me. It happened several months later when Daniel called unexpectedly. "I've been thinking about what you said outside the courthouse," he told me. "What part?" "That I never asked." He paused. "And you were right." I didn't respond. Because some realizations are better left undisturbed. Daniel's voice softened. "I spent 12 years believing I was the one holding everything together." "People believe the stories they tell themselves," I said. "And sometimes those stories are wrong." Another pause. Then he said something that surprised me. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. Or emotional. Just simple. But sometimes simple apologies carry the most truth." "I know," I replied. That conversation was the last long one we ever had. Life continued in different directions. Daniel moved to a new apartment closer to the city. I built a quieter life near the river. Neither of us tried to return to the past. Because the past had already done what it needed to do. It had taught us something. People often assume revenge stories are about punishment. About anger. About someone getting what they deserve. But the older I get, the more I realize that real justice rarely looks like revenge. More often it looks like clarity. Truth. Understanding. And sometimes, if people are lucky, a little humility. Daniel once believed I was just a housewife. A quiet presence in the background of his life. But silence can be misleading. Sometimes silence means patience. Sometimes it means wisdom. And sometimes it means someone is simply waiting for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself. If this story reminds you of someone in your own life, take a moment today to ask them a question you may have never asked before. You might be surprised by what you learn. And if this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts or reflections. Stories like this are meant to be passed along because sometimes the quietest lessons are the ones we need most. Thank you for listening.